The term traditionalism derived from the selective misreading of René Guénon, a convinced and professing non-traditionalist, is at the same time a misnomer and terminological Procrustean bed. It doesn't adequately describe its special subject, i.e., René Guénon's thought, nor does it successfully represent all those people who, for one reason or the other, claim to be holding onto some kind of tradition from which the modern world has deviated. And let us put tradition and modern world in commas. For us, this is fortunate, because we'll use this loosely defined term to describe the mentality which, by its essential orientation, understands tradition and so-called traditional world so loosely that it ends up being its very opposite, in the strictest sense of the word. It is not the opposite in the sense of good versus evil, but in the sense of good versus not good, i.e., it is opposite in every conceivable sense. The mentality we are talking about can be summed up as a need for specific kind of revolutionary ideology stemming, in its most radical forms, from the specific existential experience, the realization of nothingness of the present world. One of the most extreme representative of this radical political bent, because all revolution is a political revolution, is our old friend Alexander Dugin. In this passage, he describes his own awakening to existential conditions that proved instantly to be unbearable. Quote, I personally experienced the most acute form of this experience at the end of the 70s to early to mid-80s. I admit it was quite subjective, but this doesn't belittle its value. Experience of existence in post-Soviet period, somewhere until 82, 83, represented waking up in the pure hell in the middle of nothing. Under these conditions, the idea of radical subject was born. Later, this perception of the world, the reality as such, waned somewhat. The sharpness of experience was blunted, yet the idea led deep roots and preserved its fundamental value. Evidently, this is because it has a deep eidetic validity and resounds with sharp edges of global metaphysical structures. What is the world without opportunity of salvation? It is an environment where in general there is no tradition, nor even the traces of it, in no way, shape or form. Describing the modern world, René Guénon assumes that separate elements of tradition still linger. They became extremely rare, but they are present. Yet we will imagine the world in which there is no tradition at all. I was an ordinary citizen of the Soviet Union, born in the USSR to middle-class Soviet atheistic conformist parents, raised in a Soviet social environment, trained and received education in Soviet educational institutions. It is important that I am Russian, that is, there was no other ethnic influence explaining the sudden outburst of alienation. No other factor, external influence, circle of contacts, or other relations or spontaneous interests, which could explain this radical alienation from my surroundings. I was a part of that environment at all levels and in all directions, and knew nothing but it. Pure experience of total nihilism. The world around me was not discarded for some reason, not for any reason at all, but just because. For no reason, without any internal or external support. And the lack of support the absence of salvation, and any distant glimpse of the tradition, it was conceptually placed in the center of my being and became the basis of systematic thinking." End quote. What Dugin describes here is the radical beginning of his own intellectual development, the birth of a revolutionary so-called radical subject from the spirit of nihilism, i.e., from the experience of total absence of spirit as acting force in the world. It is no wonder that his elusive but quite adamant revolutionary doctrine represents the most radical instance of what we are going to talk about here, because it is based on the experience of not having any base at all. Arguably, all revolutionaries seek this baseless new beginning, paradoxically, at the same time running from it in panic. But, as we are talking about traditionalist revolutionaries, we'll use Dugin's ontological starting gun as a blueprint for understanding less radical and perhaps more dangerous, because more prevalent, forms of so-called revolt against the modern world. The idea that modernity is a deviation from the substantially different state of things, where there existed an opportunity to reattach oneself to principles that are transcendent to mutable historical experience, lies at the center of traditional mentality. In this sense, by traditionalism, we refer to the trueness to certain mentality, which would be quite superfluous as the specifical signifier outside of the modernity, because what it really meant, before it could have been individuated into so-called doctrine or movement, was simply adherence to what was present as prevailing metaphysics and feeling of life. The consensus is that modernity represents a radical shift away from this state into gradual alienation from traditional metaphysical principles, religions, philosophy, and social forms, necessarily in that order. The true traditionalist is the man who attempts to reattach himself to them also necessarily in that order, from the first down to the last, and never the other way around. This makes traditionalist revolutionary contradiction in terms, and from the existential viewpoint, an irreconcilable contradiction made flesh. The revolutionary is the one who attempts to bring about the overturn of the existing world, because in it he finds nothing worth living, and he wants to do this in an instant, without admission of any intermediary stages and without compromise with anything that does not accommodate his vision. This act, which is primarily an intimate decision that only outwardly takes shape of some kind of political doctrine and practice, stems from the absolutely nihilistic source, i.e., the mentality presupposing his own creative act as a necessity of existence. The revolutionary wants to create the substance of the world from nothing, because his intimate insight is that initially there is no substance to the world at all. It is my contention that this point of view is impossible outside of modernity and its aftermath. Therefore, everything based upon it is, from the standpoint of tradition, a deviation and a lie. Whether it's a communist lie or a traditionalist lie doesn't make much difference, because in the essence of it lies absolute nothing in which all cows are black. Conservative critics of revolutionary mentality tend to point out only the half of this, the amorality, hypocrisy, and sometimes downright bestiality of the revolutionaries on the left, i.e., modern revolutionaries, attempting sometimes to denounce the revolutionaries of the right as closet leftists. So, for instance, Nationalsozialismus had socialismus in it, so it's leftist, etc. However, this is a lie. The supposed traditionalist revolutionaries are as nihilistic as any communist, and truly, the two tend to blend at some point, especially when it comes to relation of radical left social politics and nationalism. Something that was the case with the idea of communist Yugoslavia, which was a creation of both higher form of socialism and a higher form of nationalism, with foreseeable, yet rarely actually foreseen, result of the bloody catastrophe. The traditionalist revolutionary is the man who, in the most radical form, as is the case with Dugin, inverts the order of tradition, i.e., he takes the inexistent social forms and tries to recreate them anew, using religious symbols and metaphysical principles as ideological guidelines. This is a process well known in Eastern Europe, notably in Western Balkans. After the fall of communism, flourishing of to a various degree suppressed religions seemed to overtake the scene, but with a new, sinister flavor, noticeable to anyone who kept his religious mentality intact throughout the communist rule. Notably, the, let's call it, outing gained forms that were declaratively traditional, in the sense of an attempt to grasp the pre-communist times traditions, while simultaneously emptying its symbols and gestures of the content that was spontaneously preserved throughout the rule of the doomed ideology. The reasons for this go deep. On the superficial level, nationalism and the abuse of religion for reinforcement of warring identities is certainly apparent, as well as the compulsive need for stability on behalf of the peoples who endure the birth pains of postmodern world, not in theory, but in the midst of their own lives. Yet there's more to it. The apparent regressive tendency in the societies that emerge after the dissolution of one of the prevalent political systems of modernity is in fact anything but. It is not regression in the past where supposedly the more authentic and stable principles and models of living can be found, but progression into new epoch, the one that is invariably characterized by dissolution. In this sense, the apparent reattachment to the past is in fact just a different form of separating from it. Only in this form the process uses the symbols and principles of tradition as ideological guidelines and decoration. From what I can perceive in right-flavored, so-called dissident intellectual circles, people further to the west regularly fall for this as a sign of somehow conservative or even traditional revolutions going on east of the Schengen. And yet they are not stricto sensu wrong. Yet what they fail to see is that these so-called revolutions are just a vehicle to subvert and destroy what is left from tradition, moreover, even more successfully than social movements they supposedly oppose. The fact of the matter is that the world inseparable from its origin, which is in effect a definition of traditional world, is now beyond the horizon, like the sun that has set, and there is no power in the hands of man that can make the sun rise up again just because they feel it should. Moreover, the attempts at this are in fact a hostile takeover of an idea of tradition, because they all stem from the arbitrary choice of what tradition is, something that is clearly displayed in Dugin's case, and are quite congruent with revolutionary mentality of modernity. Those are attempts to recreate the world, initiate the new beginning, motivated by cosmic hatred, a loathing towards all that is present. Yet, if there is one truth of tradition that cannot be eradicated or obscured, it is the fact that nothing that is can be wholly evil. This truth annihilates annihilation, i.e., it points to fundamental goodness at the heart of everything, precisely to that proverbial sun that has set. Not to be blamed for countering Dugin's impassioned experience of hell with my sterile Platonism-infused Roman heresy outlook, I'll offer a variant of initial experience which quite resembles what Dugin has described, albeit in the literary form. Quote, "He was awoken in the middle of the night by the raging heartbeat. Something was happening, and it was neither a premonition nor vague hunch any more. He rose from his bed slowly, shaking like a leaf, and walked over towards the bedroom window. With trembling hands he lit a cigarette and opened it. The vista of the benighted city was quite ordinary. The moon gleamed red in the east, swelled by the dusty, humid mist of the summer heat above the cold city lights. Yet something in the midst of it all filled him with horror. Suddenly he clearly saw it. This vista was all there is. Beyond the things there was nothing, and the value he attached to them throughout his life fell apart in one gaze, in one moment that ripped him from his slumber. Momentarily, in the instant, the realization surfaced. The realization that was long in the making, and long in hiding from the searchlight of his reflection. There's no way out and no turning back. In vain he sought in himself some support, some old or new illusion to keep him afloat. They were erased as a chalk under the wet sponge, and together with them he was being erased too. He didn't know how heart attack feels like, but the frantic heartbeat made him suspect he was in for one. The night engulfing the city now resembled a fire, black flames scorching everything there is, a hell without entrance or exit, bereft of anything that could give respite or relief, only darkness that burns. For the first time in his life he realized how powerless he was in the face of the world. And the world he awoke to that night was built on power, on beings moving about, devouring each other, in the infinite struggle bereft of meaning. The reality was horrible, threatening, and naturally it clutched him from all sides. All masks have fallen, and he couldn't imagine what could redeem all of this. No metaphysics of heroic pessimism, no nirvana, not even death. For truth be told, he was close to death. Isn't this what death really is? Erasure of everything that used to keep us going, whether we were aware of it or not. A banal fact you can't even spit in the face because, once you see it, your mouth dries up and tongue loses sound. And the only thing separating us from it, when illusions spiral to the ground like dead birds, is our tedious hunger for existence. The hunger that has to eat and in the end be eaten itself. He started to pray. There was no one to hear his anguished thought. That night, first and last in his life, he was all alone. End quote. Taking cues from the personal experience can be a slippery slope, but only insofar as it gets transformed into dogma. In the proper sense of the word, this is not an existential experience, but a state of person, necessarily assimilated in the most intimate recess of this subsistent reality that makes one this man or this woman. Yet this dark night of the soul is just one stage in the development of personal self-awareness that has to be endured and accepted as it is. It cannot be resisted when it comes, because it comes both from within and from the outside, and one's will has nothing to do with it. The horror lies precisely in the realization of the within as a source, because it forces one to face his complete impotence to substantiate the existence of his own self. The movement in the very core of person, is utterly autonomous and unrelated to consciousness or even unconscious deliberation. There is in effect nothing one can do about it. And precisely this is the purpose of the whole ordeal: to reveal the helplessness of man faced with an abyss of his own essence and, consequently, his inherent inability to somehow substantiate or even recreate this essence. In a word, man is completely being handed over at the mercy of the world and, what is even worse, himself, with the absence of spirit being the final and necessary realization. For some, obviously, this experience of absence is the clear incitement to endure and wait for proverbial dawn. For others, however, it is a call for destruction of all presence. The second choice is essentially an attempt to identify with what was being revealed in this vision by one's own effort, and can be without reserve defined as a conscious choice of eternal damnation in quite uncertain terms, because the thing revealed is in fact a foretaste of what we commonly understand as hell. We should not suppose that every traditionalist revolutionary is driven by such deep motivation. But the fact of the matter is that orientation remains the same: the end of the present world brought about by one's own will through some kind of political upheaval. The insidiousness of it all lies in the weapon of choice, the very principles of tradition used as a banner of revolution. While plethora of modern-day traditionalist movements and individuals, from religious traditionalists of all colors to geopolitical prophets and alt-righters, are mostly driven by ignorance and by the frantic yet superficial search for ideology which accommodates them best to quote-unquote make sense of the world. The impulse driving them is essentially hatred that stems from alienation choosing to annihilate itself into even deeper alienation. To be against the modern world in this sense means to be either too lazy or too vain to realize that no world can exist without true goodness and beauty, and, quite consequently, to be at the same time driven enough to proceed into destroying it. The essence of the world, in which spirit is the causal agent, is that it cannot be detached from it. Claiming that this indeed can come to pass means to deny not only the world, but spirit too. In the strictly Christian sense, one could say that this is one of the sins against the Holy Spirit, i.e., one of those that cannot be forgiven. Hence, it is quite obvious how people of this mindset, once they pass the initial phase of playing with ideas and proceed further down the path of delusion, seem to get reinforced into their conviction to an ever greater extent. The fact of the matter is that scratching beneath the surface is something one does at one's own peril, and if humility is absent, the catastrophe is inevitable. Moreover, in the realm beneath the surface, freedom rises exponentially, and unguided soul is bound to quickly find a way to become a damned one, drowning in the illusion of its own autonomy. One thing tradition tells us about, and even an occasional old woman can tell you a thing or two about it, is that there are men who are damned for their hubris, and their punishment is the furthering of their confidence in their own delusions. This is probably one of the worst things one can merit when tackling the matters of theology or metaphysics. I have no doubt people of Dugin's ilk bear this stain, and it is clearly obvious how he attracts the confused, the vain, and the envious into his orbit. After all, he represents the essential lack of essence that can accommodate every projection of the corrupted soul. In conclusion, for someone capable of discernment, traditionalist revolution in any form is a complete nonsense. The only way to be against the modern world is not to be a modern man. And this requires above all else a correspondence of thought and action which does not compromise with the spirit of the age. If one is to do this, he won't need revolutionary acts to make his life miserable, because act of quiet defiance leads to an immediate and very real loneliness in the desert of the real. The revolutionaries of every color are at best merely people trying to escape this decision into flamboyant and quite harmless posturing. At worst, however, they are metaphysical suicide bombers of the modern world.